Christian parenting.
Welcome to the Called to Love podcast, where we discuss all things adoption and foster care and dive into the practical, the clinical, and most importantly, the biblical perspectives to help you and your family thrive. I'm Summer Colbert, adopted mom, director of adoption and foster ministry, and champion for the Arkansas Baptist Children and Family Ministries. Adoption and foster care aren't just a process. They are both unique invitations to go on a journey with the Lord, where you will experience life-changing opportunities to grow in your faith and learn to love in an entirely new way. One thing is for sure, being called to love means you will never be the same. Welcome back, families, to the Call to Love podcast. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Ben Locke. And friends, I got to tell you right off the bat, we have just spent the last 30 minutes troubleshooting tech issues. So I'm telling you, the enemy does not want you to hear what Ben is about to share. And I am just really, really grateful for his heart and his message. Ben is a former professional soccer player. He is a survivor and author of the new book, In Our Suffering, Lord Be Near, Prayers of Hope for the Hurting. Guys, Ben is going to share his story of loss, his experience with abuse, and how the Lord met him in his darkest hours. Now, I want to go ahead and say this on at the front end of our conversation. Today's conversation may be a little bit difficult to hear, as we're going to discuss the realities of loss, specifically of sexual abuse, and then mental health struggles related to that. So I just want to give that disclaimer. If you have younger ears listening in, be prepared for that. So unfortunately, we know that many kids and teens who come into our care, either through foster care or adoption, have lived this unthinkable reality. And we as their parents need to have a better understanding of how they have been forever changed as a result of their experience. The good news is there is hope and there is healing through Christ. And that is what we ultimately want to focus on today. So Ben, welcome. Thank you so much for being here and being willing to share your story and speak to this difficult topic.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here, Summer. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. I want to begin because obviously I probably scared our listeners just a little bit. They're like, I don't know what's coming, but you're just delightful. And I want our listeners just to get a chance to get to know you a little bit. And let's kind of dive into a little bit of an overview of your story, and then we'll get a little bit more specific as we go further in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have been a lifelong soccer player. As you mentioned, I started kicking a ball when I was 3 years old. I'm the youngest of three, so older brother and older sister. So my brother and I, we started playing soccer from a very young age, and that was the defining piece of my life growing up. Whether or not I knew that, it became that very early. I played competitively from the time I was 6 all the way through, the early grades, middle school, high school, and then eventually got a scholarship to play in college. And so the bulk of my life has really been surrounded by and identified by and as a soccer player. And I think there's a point in which I was probably about 15 or 16. I actually left the house. I moved out of the house to pursue soccer. My family moved to Nashville, Tennessee. I moved to North Carolina to pursue the path and the trajectory that I was on. And so really that was the turning point for me. I'm 26 now, so that was 10 years ago. And soccer was already sort of the central piece of my life, but moving out of the house, it really became that. I was like, okay, I've got to get this scholarship. I've got to prove myself, go pro, all that good stuff. So I ended up graduating early from high school, actually, and starting a semester early in college. And within about a month, the wheels just started to fall off a little bit. I had my first injury. I got diagnosed with something called compartment syndrome, which I'd never heard of. I came to find out it's a potentially career-ending injury. It's really intense, and so that really was that was the catalyst for a lot of the things that started. That's how I got sidelined, and eventually that's how the abuse began with my trainer, is because I was sidelined, and so. That was about 2 or 3 years. I hardly stepped on the soccer field for my first 2.5 years of college because of injury and because of what was happening with my trainer. So I ended up transferring to a school here in Nashville, Tennessee. Halfway through my college career, I had 3 surgeries in 3 years. Eventually got onto the field, played a couple of seasons, was still sort of trying to make the trajectory of professional soccer. Ended up getting into a car accident actually before my senior year, and that was really the final nail in the coffin for me. That that led to a series of autoimmune diseases and neurological stuff. And so, long story long, that's how I got to the place of beginning to write. Writing really started as a expression of the darkest things that I had been going through, and really because I couldn't do much else. So that's sort of the high level overview.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. There's so much to that. And I think we can all relate to that on a very personal level, and whether we've experienced something in the way of loss ourselves or we're watching our kids go through that, and just how we form our identities is an important conversation. So there's so much that we could talk about in all of this conversation today, Ben. But for our listeners, specific to some of the abuse and loss that you have experienced, we know that for many of our kids, whether they're foster or adopted, their past includes some form of abuse. And this abuse is not always disclosed, or sometimes its effects are minimized when a child is placed with a family. And so families just are not equipped, or they're not prepared to deal with that, to know how to respond, to know how to help a child, to know how to advocate for a child. And so I want to hear from you, certainly your advice and all of these different things. But let's just begin with something very basic of some warning signs that parents need to be aware of if sexual abuse in particular is suspected.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there is the precursor for everything, in my opinion, is trust. Building trust with your
Yeah.
child is sort of the foundation of being able to have conversations that are more difficult. And abuse is obviously something that, as a young person, it started for me when I was 17. So I was older too, and as a man and
Yeah.
as a college athlete, that was much different, versus being younger. I think the experience of abuse is it's a lot of confusion, and so to sort of have a an existing foundational level of trust with your parent where you feel like at the very least I can go to mom or dad and say this thing happened to me and I'm not sure if it's normal. And so I think that was one of the biggest challenges for me. I didn't really know. I didn't have a baseline of what normal, what's allowed. And so it started happening to me and I felt extremely uncomfortable and started processing those things. But I just processed them internally because I didn't know what to do with it. So
Yeah.
the warning signs too, I mean, I think characteristics and personality traits about your child will change. I think that I got very quiet. I isolated. That was probably my biggest warning sign. And my parents did notice that, but I wasn't at a place where I had processed what was happening, so I couldn't really communicate it. But I think abuse in particular is very, very isolating. So I would say that's the biggest red flag is if all of a sudden you're noticing a child that or an adult, a young adult, a teen that's isolating. I think that can be a really big red flag.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. And, fortunately, God gives us the ability as parents to know when something's off with our kids. And so that can be a hard question to ask, or a hard way to get around really figuring out the why behind the behavior. And so I know that you talked about, there's definitely this element of shame associated with the abuse, and even blame for being responsible for the abuse itself. And so what advice would you give to parents who might be suspicious but they don't quite know how to ask what's going on with their child?
Yeah, I think that you nailed it. It has to be a process of peeling back the layers, and I think that that's true with anything that's pretty serious in nature. Mental health, I think, is similar. It's not going to be a young person is not going to address the question of, hey, were you abused, or hey, are you depressed? It's a peeling back of, you know what's going on. I've noticed something's been going on. Are you okay? Did something happen at school? Whatever those things are. And again, I think that having to have an environment in a home that establishes mom I can trust mom and dad with the things that I say. I think that was a big challenge for me is I felt afraid of sharing really intimate and personal details of my life outside of the abuse too. Things that I was struggling
Right.
with girls, relationships, friendships, coaches, all that kind of stuff. And so to establish that, again, I know I've said that already, but knowing that I can come to mom and dad and share something that might not be something that I'm proud of, and they're going to have grace with me. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. And, for those of us who were not the reason for the abuse, as the parents, and it can be really difficult because this wall can be placed, between the child and because, like you said, trust is key. And so we already know, we talk about that a lot on this podcast of establishing trust with our child. And it is a process and it is a time commitment. And it's not something that you can just, I'm the chief of fixers. Like, I just want to fix it. I want to identify the problem, the
Right.
why behind it. I want to fix it. I want to move on. And that's the last thing that we can do in situations like this when we're trying to connect with our kids or with our teens, especially when they've experienced things like this, that all they want to do is put up those walls of self protection. So I think that's a really great point that you make. You mentioned mental health, and I think that's an important thing too. Is we know that this kind of experience has a tremendous impact on mental health, and so what do we need to be aware of? You talk about just as a society expectations, and even that the church might not be talking about. There's this idea of mental health, and then there's faith, and they kind of almost seem separated. So we know that this has tremendous impact on our mental health. So where do we even start with that conversation of helping our kids from a biblical and even a therapeutic standpoint?
Yeah, that what really jumps out to me is the balance, and obviously this is embodied in nobody better than Christ, but the balance between discipline and grace is really really important. As a parent, I think, and I have a great relationship with both of my parents, but I think the natural tendency for a parent is discipline. Like you said, disciplining is can come forward in the process of trying to fix, like you said, trying to figure out what happened, trying to make sure that your child knows that that was wrong, and therefore how we can not do that again. Whereas I would argue that Christ usually meets us with grace first, and then once grace establishes a foundation of trust, then discipline happens, because I'm willing to receive that from a parent, from God, is the same situation, but I have to know that I've been offered grace first. Otherwise, I'm not going to be comfortable, because the other
Right.
important part of that is, especially with mental health, grace also extends sort of the invitation to vulnerability. And so as a guy, as a man especially, it took me incredibly long to come to a place where I felt like I could be vulnerable. I just didn't tell people. That was my challenge. I couldn't tell people. I was terrified to let people know, because I couldn't be vulnerable. I didn't know what it meant to be vulnerable. In fact, as a man, I thought I shouldn't be vulnerable and I should keep those things kind of tucked down. So, um, grace, it being sort of the first response, that usually incurs all these other things: vulnerability, trust, discipline. And as a parent, there is a responsibility for discipline. So it's not, we don't push it to the side completely, but it's the timing, it's the nature, and it's the method of discipline, which usually should come, I think, further down the line.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And it's just such a hard thing for us to wrap our brains around. And so you've got this child who you love with all your heart who's dealing with this unthinkable thing, and then you yourself are trying to process it.
Right.
And that's really, really challenging. And so I don't ever want to downplay. It's like, okay, you've discovered this, and now here's the quick fix, and here's the 5-step path to healing, and everything's going to be fine. This is something that affects you for the long term, and it becomes part of your story forever. And I want to back up a little bit, Ben, because I think it's important. You identified the biggest thing for us to look out for is that isolation. But with all of our changes in behavior and the way that we cope with the abusive experience. And so I think it would be helpful for us to highlight, and I know you kind of talk about this a little bit, just the different coping mechanisms that kids and teens turn to in order to deal with their abusive experience. Can you identify some of those for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it looks different, for everybody. Obviously, for me, I think it was I took that, and it translated to real challenges with girls and relationships with girls. I just had an unhealthy perspective of, again, what it meant to be with another person in a relationship, physical relationship, mental relationship, emotionally. As a high schooler, as a college kid, that I had no idea what. And I talk about this a lot. The word intimacy now is I've come to realize is one of the most important things that I've struggled to understand. And so the challenges of intimacy was a very confusing thing for me. And so relationships with girls and vice versa, girls with guys, I'm sure is the same thing. And how to navigate that, especially in a God honoring way, was really, really tough for me. And I made a lot of mistakes in that sense. And then I think, of course, things like drugs and drinking, that was another challenge. I think, when you are dealing with something incredibly dark and just flat out evil like this, the natural tendency is I want to numb. I want to numb what I'm experiencing over here. and numb it over here so that I don't have to face it or cope with it. I was fortunate in some ways as well that I had a sport that really dominated my life. I spent so much time playing soccer that that was my coping method, was I would go to the gym or I would go to the soccer field. But there are so many layers even there that, became unhealthy too. So, yeah, I think you nailed it. It's coping. We want a coping mechanism to just sort of dull out and numb out what's happening or have happened in the past.
Yeah, and that makes total sense because you have this event take place or series of events, a time frame of events that are so traumatizing for you, and the enemy takes a foothold because then you don't know how to process, you isolate, then you start to cope, and through all of this, you talk about this feeling of like almost disqualification
Right.
from being able to turn back from that path. And I think that's a really important point that I appreciate you bringing out. And you talk about, being disqualified from being able to pray and think about being able to receive love in a healthy way, receive forgiveness, or even hope for the brokenness that you're walking through. And so, how would you encourage, parents to respond to kids who are just walking down that path of destruction that it started through no fault of their own, and they're wanting desperately to pull them back? So, share a little bit of just your experience with that, and then maybe advise us as parents of how we can reach their hearts and help them to understand that that's a lie that they're disqualified.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much there. The older I've gotten, I suppose the more mature, hopefully more mature I've gotten. I think it's really important for believers in the church to acknowledge that these things happen and they exist, and believers struggle with them. I think even the words like sex and drugs and drinking and pornography, these are real things. And in the church, and this was my experience, we have a tendency to either not talk about them and therefore kind of hope that they're being dealt with in the dark and kept in the dark, which is just so the opposite of what Christ calls us to do, or we're condemning. We're just so condemning about these experiences that it's the shame and the guilt that a young person feels from struggling with something that's very real or could be connected to trauma or abuse or depression or anxiety, is that it just has to go away. Neither of those things are very effective, and I would argue neither of them are rooted in biblical truth. And so to act as if it doesn't exist or should just stay hidden, or to just kind of come bring the hammer down on people, neither of those things, I think, is very helpful. So I think for our culture, for parents, but also for kids to know, hey, this is the world we live in. The evil exists. These are the tools and the tactics that the enemy uses. And here's how we're going to address them. One of the things that I've started to learn again at my age now, looking back, is God is God has set things apart because he loves me, because he wants to preserve them. Sex is something that God created that's good, but he created it for marriage. And so what I was taught was, don't do it. Don't do this. Don't drink. Don't have sex. Don't do drugs. Versus God has something so beautiful, so lovely that he designed, and it's good, and so to not skew and thwart the good things that God created, has been really important. And I think that's really important in family dynamics. Like, don't just say don't do this, but say here's why we wait, here's why we turn to the Lord, that kind of thing.
Fall will be here before we know it. And as you start to think about back to school, I want to encourage you to think about how you can be praying for your kids this coming school year. It's so easy to get caught up in all of the daily tasks of parenting, right? We're getting school supplies, coordinating schedules, doing the laundry, making snacks, then making more snacks. Am I right? But as Christian parents, it's important to remember the big picture. The one thing that truly matters is teaching our kids to know, love, follow, and share Jesus. And so because of that, I am so excited to tell you that the Christian Parenting 2024-2025 Prayer Journal is now available. It's called A Life of Faith, Knowing, Loving, Following, and Sharing Jesus, and it is a prayer journal from Christian Parenting that was created just for you. This journal will guide you in praying over your kids every week of the coming school year. Together, we will pray that our children will know Jesus as their Savior, love Him with their hearts, minds, and strength, and follow Him faithfully through their entire lives, and boldly share His good news with others. Thousands of parents use this journal every year, so join us as together we pray that our kids live a full life of faith. You can visit cpgive.org to request your school year prayer journal, A Life of Faith. Again, that's cpgive.org, and request your copy of A Life of Faith today. Now let's get back to the conversation. Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic advice. I'm curious as you're sharing all this because obviously the gospel is sprinkled in every aspect of your story and everything that you're sharing with us. When did you come to Christ in the midst of your story that you're sharing with us today?
Yeah, like I mentioned, I grew up in the church, so I use the metaphor that I feel like I know God in the same way that I knew a celebrity on TV. You know,
Mm,
I could see LeBron James on TV and be like, "Hey, I know LeBron James." I could picture him or whoever it is. But if I walked past LeBron James on the sidewalk and I was like, "Hey, it's me, Ben," he'd be like,
yeah.
"Who are you? You're crazy." Versus, a relationship with the Lord that's like, I know him, he knows me, I know where I'm going, I know where I come from. That's a completely different knowing. And so I would say I knew God in the first context when I was younger. I think that it's really been in the last few years. When I got really sick, is really when I started to wrestle with my faith. And so in the last
Mm.
3 or 4 years, really when I started writing this book was where I came to know Christ. And my book says that, like, really know him, not know him on Sundays, but walk with him every day. So it was much later in life.
Yeah. That's amazing. I love that example that you give. I mean, that just really makes sense. It hits home in a way you're like, oh, okay, I get that. I'm going to use that. Okay.
Yeah.
Borrowing that from you. So, along those lines, that's a really great point, though, because you're talking about when you come to this place where you're just in darkness and suffering and you're feeling all this loss and you're wrestling with all these feelings of guilt and shame and trying to navigate and process everything that you're experiencing in life. That's where you truly felt like you came to that place of knowing the Lord. And that's a hard thing to explain to a kid or a teen who has not come from a faith background of any kind, who, could even come to a place of where they're blaming God for the fact that they've experienced all these different
Mm.
things. And so, how would you advise, parents or caregivers to help their child navigate that and be like, okay, this is not about blaming God, but this is about knowing him and allowing him to use this for his glory and his good and seeing those things that he set aside for your good, like you were talking about.
Uh, this might sound harsh, but I think we need to be reminded of the fact that God is the one that changes people's hearts.
Yeah,
I can't change another person's heart. I can be used as a God can use me for sure, but ultimately the heart change lies with God.
that's
And I
right.
think that's one of the hardest things for us to accept as brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, children is I love this person so much that I want to change their heart, but I can't. I can't. Even in marriages, I think that happens all the time. I can't
Yeah,
change a person's heart. God can. Now, at the same time, we're interceding and we're called to be in prayer constantly and interceding on other people's behalf. But I think that one of the things that actually broke down a lot for me is I took my blame to God. There were definitely seasons of my life where I was blaming God, and I've had to confess that, and I've kind of come around to understanding
yeah,
what that actually means now that I know the Lord. But it ties into what I just said. God changed my heart by me coming to Him with a hardened heart. And I think I found a lot of inspiration in Job and in the Psalms because I didn't realize that you could say and pray the things that they say that they said and prayed. And so I was freed to at least I was going to God with my doubt. I was going to him with my questions. I was going to him with my anger. And I would absolutely say I was going to him with my blame. Now I was doing that as a young kind of immature and struggling to my faith process. But God took that and completely changed my life. And so I think there's a little bit of space that needs to be allowed in that to say, if you're taking it to God, He can do a lot with that. Now, if I'm taking
yeah.
my blame and I'm not taking it to the Lord, that's a very different story. But if I'm taking those things to God, He can absolutely reconcile that.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a great point, Ben, because and that's for us as parents, going back to that fixer mentality, right? And there we have a generation of parents who just what do they call it, lawnmower parents or helicopter parents, all
Yeah.
the things that they just, they clear the path for their kids so that resistance is not a factor, which we know is a joke
Yes.
because we all experience resistance. But as a parent, we just want to swoop in and we deny our kids the ability to process their story and to look to the Lord because ultimately we can't save our kids for them. Like you're saying, you have to make that decision yourself to have that relationship with Him. And so I think that's a really important point. And you talk about lashing out, to the Lord and just being very authentic and raw before Him and creating the space to be able to do that. And I think that's really something that I want to hone in on just over the next couple of moments here is we as parents need to give our kids space to grieve, to process, and not necessarily just to swoop in and fix, but we need to walk alongside them, like you were talking about earlier, building that trust, having the resources in place to speak truth, to speak scripture for our kids to hear us praying over them, lamenting with them over, just the grief of what has taken place. I mean, I cannot imagine what your parents must have felt when they came to realize what had happened to you, and just the first thing we want to do is protect, and that was something. So then we feel like failures, and it's just the enemy can have a heyday in our minds, with all of the things that go on. And so I think allowing that space for our kids to process and live out their own grief and story and walk alongside them instead of just hovering and fixing, right? Ben, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, absolutely. You nailed it. And I'm thinking of the scripture like grieve with those who grieve, mourn with those who mourn. One of my favorite passages in the entire Bible, actually, at least connected to what I've gone through in my past and present, is there's a part in Job. Job's friends get judged in the end because they kind of change their course. But I want to point out the first interaction that we see between Job and his friends is they come and the Bible says that they sit together for 7 days and nobody says a word and they just cry. They cry together
Yeah.
because they recognize the pain that Job is experiencing. And part of it makes me sad because I'm like, that's incredible friendship. And that's an incredible example, I think, of there are just situations in life where I just need to sit with you and weep. And we need to weep together. And there's nothing for me to say. There's nothing for me to fix. I just need to cry with you, and you need to know that I'm there crying with you. And I think that there's an example in that for parents and kids as well. There's a time for discipline, but there's also a time for tears and mourning and grieving. And I think it would be an incredible example for mom and dad to just sit with their children in suffering for a little bit and just acknowledge and sit in it for a moment, because your child is going to be so overwhelmed, and there's something about the presence of a parent being like, this is just hard and I'm sorry, period. There's nothing else.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice, and that's a hard thing to do because there's usually that
Very.
knee jerk of all the feels and all the things that we feel like we have to take action on, and that is it feels like a dying concept, honestly, in our society where everything is very quick, instant gratification, and we're disconnected as a society. We're more committed to our phones and a device, or something along those lines, than we are to just being with people and being in fellowship and mourning and grieving together, as you're talking about. And so that in of itself takes intentionality in a world that's not common anymore. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I want to get practical just in the last few minutes of our conversation today, Ben, because I think this is important. You've given us so much context with your story. You've given us just really great perspective in everything that you've shared. But I want to go back to the practicalities of the abuse experienced and how, like, for example, let's just begin with this question. How do you feel like we as parents should be coaching our kids to look out for warning signs of abusers and how we need to respond if that line is crossed?
That is a fantastic question. That is the question. So I would just want to applaud that, encourage that. That is the question to be asking. I think that the headline answer is just talking about boundaries. Like there is such there are really clear boundaries when it comes to these things. When I came forward about what happened to me, it was incredible. The things that I sort of communicated as if they were kind of okay, where a totally objective person heard it and they were like, that is incredibly inappropriate. Like that is so
Yeah,
far over the boundary. So I think especially in the parent-child dynamic, the knowledge for a kid to know these are the boundaries that a teacher, a coach, somebody that's older than you should have. And so to establish that from the beginning,
Yeah.
I think is really important. I think that, you know, I would go so far as to say behaviors like being alone with a child, in driving them places, being in a room together alone. I think that there's warning signs there. Now, I want to be really careful because I don't want to ascribe things that are totally innocent, but um, that all comes down to boundaries. And so to look at your child at whether they're playing a sport or they're involved in a school program or a theater program or whatever it is, especially when there is a an age and a power dynamic where there's somebody
Yeah.
in authority over your child, to make sure that child knows what boundaries look like in terms of physical boundaries, in terms of what they say. I think that's really important too. That context. Oh, did they asked you that question? Why do you think they asked you that question? It's not just physical. There's a lot of things that happen verbally that are really important that parents understand. So I would just really encourage that really blunt conversation. That might be a little uncomfortable for kids and for
Yeah.
parents, but it's so necessary.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I'll add to that, Ben. Something that we have coached our kids on is adults never really need help from kids. So if you have an
Yes.
adult coming to you saying, "Hey, can you help me with this? Can you come with me to help me with this?"
So good.
That is a clear red flag. And so teach your kids that. The other important thing is to teach anatomically appropriate language, so that if you have code names or pet names or different things like that for the different body parts, there's that zone of propriety where there's just body parts that are never to be touched by another person. um, Teach them the correct words for that so that it doesn't get lost in the messaging of, you know anyway, I could go into all of that, but just teach anatomically correct language, I think, is something that's really, really important. And so that's really good advice, Ben. I think there's a lot of, shall we say, cognitive dissonance when abuse begins, when that slow fade starts to happen and inappropriate things, that boundary line is crossed, as you're talking about. And so it can be really easy for our kids to, maybe they're coming home and they're saying, well, coach so and so or teacher so and so or whatever. And we're like, oh no, I'm sure that was misunderstood. I'm sure.
Right.
And that's really, really a dangerous slippery slope, because our kids are trying to come to us and telling us. And so speak to that for us a moment, Ben, about it. It's a hard thing to hear and it's a hard thing to process. And then you don't want to make waves and falsely accuse somebody. I mean, that's a really sticky area. So, how would you encourage parents to respond if their child is coming home and expressing something that seems inappropriate?
Yeah, that's I. It's so fascinating because I'm thinking back to moments that I had too with people in
Yeah.
my life where what's going to happen, or what more than likely will happen, is that something will be said and then it'll be shrugged off, like but it's not a big deal, or he said this or she said this or he did this or she did that, and but it's fine. I'm sure that's what a kid will do. That's what I did. It was like, oh yeah, he said this, but it was no big deal. And I think, especially for parents, it starts with your kid and nothing else. I think that's the priority, is trying to peel back the layers just between you and your child. Like, try to poke and get a little bit further into, well, wait, what did they say? Can you just remind me what they said, and what was the context of that, and has anything else happened, to try and get a little bit more information. And then what I would always encourage parents to do as well is, as I agree, it's really gray. Things can really be gray, and that makes it challenging. There are people that are in positions to kind of act as a mediator. That's the other thing that I think is important. I never came forward until I went to therapy. I met a therapist, and that was sort of the bridge and my family, God bless them, were the ones that pushed me to do that. They were like, go sit with a therapist and talk some of these things out. And that's really what began the process for me. So I think that's
Okay.
parents trying to act as a mediator, I think, is really good. So trying to get some information, but also, in order to take maybe some of those next steps, bring another person into the fold that can function as more of a third party. Because what's more than likely as well is your child might trust saying that to a person like that, versus not being a little less comfortable sharing that with mom and dad.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And again, it's this unthinkable thing. It's this scenario that you're like, I never want to have to be in this
Yeah.
club, to, having had experience something like this. But I think it's important to hear this type of thing, to have the practical things packed away in our minds, for the just in case scenario, because the reality is the abuse is everywhere, and there are perpetrators who are lurking everywhere. And so we've got to be prepared and do the best that we can. I know that, you coming forward and kind of walking that path of accountability against your abuser has been very healing for you. what advice would you have for parents, when they're walking through that? I mean, because typically, abuse, we bring that to light, and there's a lot that goes around that. And so, as we're kind of, rounding out our conversation today, I want to talk about that component because accountability is always necessary for the abuser and crucial, I think, towards the abused path towards healing. Speak to that for us a little bit, Ben.
Yeah, the most important thing, the overarching thing, I didn't know this sort of when the process began, but now I do, is forgiveness. The biblical
Mm,
context for suffering, especially at the hands of another person, is forgiveness. And so I think as a survivor, as a victim, whatever word you want to use, our goal, especially in the context of faith, is forgiveness. Because I can tell you, I explored every other means necessary: bitterness, anger, resentment, judgment, condemnation, getting into things in the world that I hoped would take my pain away. None of it worked until I started to realize that I needed to forgive. And forgiveness has been the key to
mm,
healing for me. And the key there too is I don't need that person to ask for my forgiveness in order for me to forgive them. The man who did this
yeah.
to me is somebody that I've already forgiven, and that's going to be a lifelong process too. I didn't just say I forgive you and therefore I felt 100 times better. I'm gonna have to choose to forgive for however much I'm here on this earth. So I think that's what I would really encourage. Forgiveness is the solution, if you will. That's a really black and white word, but that's the only freedom that exists in a situation like this, is forgiveness. And so
Yeah.
fostering that in a familial context, in a family context, I think is vital. I would also say the other side, just more on a practical level, the process of coming forward is very challenging. In the context that I did it, I came forward publicly, and there were reasons for that that I think are very nuanced. And I would not always encourage that. In fact, for most people, I would probably encourage they not. I had an incredible support system and a lot of people in my life that have made that very possible. I think all the things that happen internally are what matters: counsel, wisdom, connecting and assuring that there's a bond as a family. Those things are much more important. The process of coming forward it's really challenging, and it has been healing, but it's been really hard.
Mm, yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. And all of this, the Lord has used you, as we were talking about, kind of your writing being that outlet to really walk this path with the Lord, being, looking to Him for the ongoing forgiveness and the healing that you're talking about, and it's come together beautifully in our suffering. Lord, be near. And so I want to make sure that our listeners know a little bit more about that, how they can get a copy, how that can be beneficial as they may be walking this journey themselves as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you bringing that up. So it's available everywhere. It's in Amazon, on Amazon, Target, Barnes and Noble, all that good stuff. So anywhere you could find a book, you should be able to find mine. And then there's an audiobook and a Kindle, all that good stuff. So however you like to read your books, you should be able to track it down pretty easily. Outside of that, yeah, the function of it really is, in my mind, it's a little more of a devotional. It's 100 prayers, and so it's very interactional between what I hope is the reader and the Lord directly. My hope is that people kind of use it and can come back to it. There are 9 really defined sections, and so it's more of a reference. And what I wanted for it was for people to use it that way, for it to be, I'm going through a process or a season of grief or wandering or despair. And those are sort of how the things are titled. And I can use this prayer sort of as my own voice, as my own expression. Because a lot of times I have found in seasons of suffering, it's hard to find the words. We don't know what to say. There are a
Yes.
lot of prayers that I've had that have been very quiet. And it's just me crying, or it's the Spirit, groaning on my behalf. So my hope is that the book, people can open the book and kind of, it can be their own voice. It can be their own prayers with the Lord. So that's really my desire, and how I hope people use it.
I love that. And that's just another reason why, Ben, I'm so grateful for you, just joining me for this conversation today, because as you said, sometimes we don't have the language. And especially if we are caring for and welcoming for children who were not the cause of the abuse, were not the cause of the mistrust, and we don't know where to start with our kids, if we're able to build trust in this way, and this can be a tool that can come alongside us as we're leading our kids through this healing journey and as they're suffering and they're grieving and the loss and whatever they've experienced. What a fantastic resource. And so, listeners, I'm going to have the link in today's show notes. As soon as you're done listening, please head over and check that out. Get a copy of Ben's book. And Ben, I am so grateful. Thank you for your willingness just to share your story, to speak into our listening audience today. Y'all, I know you've been blessed. I've been blessed. Ben, thank you for being my guest today.
Absolutely, Summer. Thank you so much for having me.
I love to hear from listeners, and so I would love to connect with you to hear your stories and answer your questions right here on the show. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram, send me a direct message, or send me an email at the link in today's show notes. I pray you have been encouraged by today's episode to walk in faith and continue to embrace your own call to love. Until next time, blessings, sweet friends.